The History of the Black Legion, 13th Black Crusade, Chapter 5. Faith. In the right hands it is humanity's greatest weapon, yet even the finest blade is rendered fallible by its wielder. In the wrong hands the mighty sword of faith can do more hurt to the Emperor's realm than can all the treacherous demons of the warp combined. This is why those who profess to be the most holy amongst us must be put to the sternest test. Inquisitor Greyfax. The nodal cavern shook violently, the bedrock of Cadia trembling under the weight of clashing titans. This was no strategic battle. It was a brutal, close-quarters brawl where enemies were close enough to see the hatred in each other's eyes. Lieutenant Commander Cervantes of the Ultramarines sensed something was wrong. The broad strokes of the battle were familiar, but the details were off. The enemy appeared to be traitors, but their heraldry was unfamiliar, and the war gear of his allies seemed somehow cruder. Nonetheless, one certainty remained. The foes of the Imperium had risen and would be crushed by Ultramar's might. A thunderous demolisher shell ripped Call from his binharic trance as the final synapse connection snapped into place. His multifaceted eyes took in the losing battle around him, and his mind shifted into war mode. The pylon node needed time to process his instructions and unfurl the schema he had devised. His carapace crackled as tertiary life support systems bled power into his weapon augments. Vox grills cleared, and the syllables of the lingua technis rose unconsciously. Across the chamber, the voices of electro-priests and skitari joined in, finding strength in the Omnisia's blessings. Abaddon felt an unfamiliar uncertainty as he looked at the hunched figure of Belisarius Call. Had the adepts of Mars finally discerned the strategy of eons? Doubt crept in. The despoiler had intended to break Cadia's defenders before destroying them, to display strength as demanded by the brutal hierarchy of the Black Fleet and the Dark Gods. But had he made a fatal mistake? Horus had failed through bravado, seeking battle when none was needed? Had Abaddon too succumbed to pride? Recognizing the battle for Cadia had reached its decisive moment, Abaddon commanded his sorcerers to breach the immaterium. As reality's veil tore, a host of blood-hungry demons burst into the cavern. The despoiler, channeling every ounce of his warp-granted power, hurled himself back into the fray with a snarl. The last Contemptor dreadnought fell to a trio of hellbrutes, and the Ultramarines' situation grew dire. Fire danced through the air, forming the somber shadows of the Legion of the Damned. Unyielding, they marched to aid the Ultramarines, their bolters spitting soul fire. A many-armed Slaneshi demon led a capering horde into the Vestroyan ranks, spewing blasphemous promises. Call's solar atomizer flared, disintegrating the beast into glowing dust. The Capic Eagle's scions collapsed, coughing bloody bile as Nurgle's gifts took hold. Cataphron battle servitors converged their fire, melting Morlophines to slag. The cavern trembled, dust scattering from fissures as colossal stalactites fell, crushing both traitor and loyalist. "Cadia stands!" The battle cry thundered across the cavern, issuing from 1,000 voices. The Cadian 8th Regiment fired again, and with Creed's rallying call still upon their lips, they surged over broken stone and bloody corpses, seeking to avenge their fallen comrades. Howling shapes joined them, blurs of fang and slate-grey armour bearing the Iron Wolves' sigils. Wulfen led the charge. Battle Brothers lost to the Space Wolves' ancestral curse. Even those who followed, including High Fell, fought with a wild ferocity, their humanity slipping away with each blow. The Iron Wolves knew the savagery of war would hasten their devolution, but they unleashed their inner beasts for Russ and the All-Father. The Black Legion pressed on, driven by 10,000 years of hate, pride and fury. The Bringers of Despair tore into the Ultramarines with blade and fist, rending cataphractii armour and pulverizing the flesh beneath. The Talon of Horus ripped Cervantes' sword arm from its socket. Dracunian split him in two. Their captain's loss only stiffened his battle brothers' resolve, and they met the Black Legion's fury with discipline instilled by Guilliman himself. Even as the Capic Eagles poured fire into the Black Legion's flank, it became clear that discipline and fury alone wouldn't overcome 10,000 years of blessed hate. More was needed. With a groaning roar, a section of the ceiling the size of a landing field gave way. Cadians and Capics scattered or were crushed beneath the debris. The Black Legion fought on. Abaddon, standing over Cervantes' lifeless body, sought the soul whose death would break the defender's will. Pride had led Abaddon to this moment. It could not be ignored. His gaze settled on the heavy-set general who had escaped him on the plains above, Ursakar E. Creed. Cadia had stood too long because of him, and the dark gods demanded his soul. With a bellowed command, gore-slicked demons and chaos terminators of the Black Legion charged at the Cadian Eighth. Golden light poured through the shattered ceiling, flooding the nodal chamber. Celestine, the living saint the Emperor's chosen, arrived with no hesitation or doubt. Fire streamed from her wingtips as she descended to confront the despoiler. Demons lunged at her, but a sweep of the ardent blade cast them broken to the ground. Winged possessed clawed at her, but the Gemini superior struck them from the air. It was the spiritual daughter of the Emperor versus the heir to the greatest traitor in human history. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Soulfire roiled as the ardent blade met Draconien, the clash echoing with hope and despair. Abaddon was far mightier. Alone, Celestine had no chance of victory, but she was not alone. The Gemini superior fought at her side, the three of them battling the despoiler as one. At the cavern's edge, Greyfax watched Celestine's arrival with revulsion. How long had she been gone for such heresy to take root? Battle sisters powered by idolatry. Adeptus Astartes warriors revelling in their own mutations. Spirits wreathed in hellfire. And yet the loyal soldiers of Cadia and Ultramar embraced these evils for the sake of victory. Greyfax's Puritan certainty had always held that evil had no shades, no lesser forms that could be tolerated. Purity was perfection, uncompromising and ideal. She had killed thousands for lesser sins than this, including her own kind. What victory could there be if strict precepts were torn apart? Shadows reformed around her, green eyes blazed. Greyfax aimed her condenser pattern bolter between them. Abomination. That word again? A metal hand gestured lazily across the cavern. I suspect your priorities need reassessment. You spread corruption wherever you tread. Your reckoning is overdue. She tried to pull the trigger. Nothing happened. Trazyn opened his palm, a flood of microscopic machines flowing over his fingers. I'm not a fool. The mind shackle will not let you harm me. Bile flooded Greyfax's mouth. Anger burned it away. You have corrupted me as you did Valeria. A precaution only. As for Valeria, she had a remarkable brain. You robbed me of the opportunity for study. Again, Greyfax tried to pull the trigger. Again, nothing happened. Useless. I brought you here out of common cause, Trazyn said. I'm not done with this world, and neither is your Imperium. If you want to save it, focus your formidable certainty elsewhere. Our reckoning can wait. With a snarl, Greyfax turned away. At last, slivers of data coalesced in Call's mechanical mind. The nodal grid was ready. A labour that might overshadow 10,000 years of lesser works was complete, yet doubt crept in. What if the Necron had lied? Call had barely scratched the surface of the pylon's function. But as the last of the time-lost Ultramarines struck his dying blow, Call's priorities snapped back into focus. Logic dictated that the clear and present danger took precedence over unsubstantiated premonition. Offering one last prayer to the Omniseer, Call sent the command. The resonant pulse of the Cadian pylons, normally unheard except by warp sensitives, grew steadily in pitch and volume. The rumble consumed the roar of battle across the Elysian fields. Black lightning crackled along the pylons' flanks. Combatants collapsed, blood streaming from their ears and noses. Psychers froze as their connection to the immaterium faded, their minds dragged into oblivion. Black light leapt from the pylon's pinnacles, converging in the upper atmosphere, the outer edge brushing Phalanx's golden flank. The battle fortress's engines flared in evasive action as the monolithic beam seared across the stars, aimed at the heart of the Eye of Terror. Slowly, too subtly for instruments to detect, the warp rift known as the Ocularis Terribus began to shrink. Though none in the nodal cavern understood the scope of Call's undertaking, its effects were immediate. Abaddon's host of demons, already made unstable by the pylons, slipped further into the abyss. Demon-fused traitors bellowed their last as their cursed halves were torn into the void. Possessed war engines fell silent. Greyfax screamed as the immaterium purging grasp of the pylons clawed at her mind. Righteous anger anchored her to reality. Even Abaddon staggered, but he endured, snarling as the blessings of his dark patrons faded. Others were not so fortunate. The Legion of the Damned blinked out like wind-guttered candles, their flames snuffed by the pylon's power. Even Celestine, the Emperor's will made flesh, dimmed. The golden light faded, and with it, the hopes of mankind. Faith, which had sustained Cadia's defense, began to recede. Valor faded among Creed's regiment, the Capic Eagles and the Vostroyans. The Black Legion cared not that most of their demon host was gone and the remainder weakened. They saw only proof that the false Emperor's light was fading, and took new strength from the sight. The battle for the nodal cavern intensified, its pace accelerating. Orvan Highfell perished among his snarling brethren, gauntlets gripping a bloodthirster's throat even as the beast tore him apart. The Wolfen avenged him, tearing the demon to shreds with fang and claw. But one by one they too fell to their wounds, leaving behind a trail of dead traitors as their final offering to the Allfather. Creed stood firm with the 8th Cadian at his side, as always. Their example inspired the stern men of Vostroya. The Capic Eagles, determined to prove that the scions of the Schola Progenium could match any Imperial Guardsman, found their courage in pride. The duel of ideologies continued, Abaddon on one side, the living saint and her Gemini superior on the other. What had started as an evenly matched battle now favoured Abaddon. Even before receiving the Dark God's blessings, he was one of the greatest warriors of the Legiones Astartes. Without the Emperor's light, Celestine was merely a mortal shell, reborn too many times from the tides of the immaterium. Her handmaidens, extensions of her waning psychic light, were weakened by the immaterium's recession. Their resolve remained unwavering, but the outcome seemed inevitable. Eleanor was thrown from the duel, blood dripping from her lips. The Black Guard surrounded Genevieve, their Terminator armor and roaring chainswords forming an impenetrable wall even her blessed sword couldn't pierce. The ardent blade clashed with Draconian repeatedly, but Celestine's efforts were now focused solely on defense. And even those desperate parries grew weaker with each strike. Finally, a backhand blow knocked Celestine to her knees. Creed saw the living saint fall and knew her death would signify the end of all they had fought for. Shouting orders, he led the 8th Cadian in a final desperate charge. Draconian descended, and Celestine screamed in agony. As Abaddon raised the demon sword for another strike, Celestine struggled to her feet, clutching a bloody gash in her armor but meeting his gaze without fear. "You cannot win. Mankind will be free of your masters," Celestine declared, facing Abaddon. "There is no freedom," Abaddon responded, his face unreadable. Draconian thrust forward, but suddenly Abaddon was seized by agony. Searing pain arced through his synapses as an attack channeled through the fading immaterium struck him. The demon blade, poised to pierce Celestine's heart, froze mid-strike. Katerina Greyfax gritted her teeth, channeling all her rage into a psychic assault. Though she loathed to admit it, Trazyn had been right. Her priorities had strayed. An Inquisitor's duty was to the Imperium, not personal grievances. While all heresies must be purged, some demanded more immediate attention. Abaddon's sins took precedence. Blinded and staggering, Abaddon fought back, his will meeting Greyfax's psychic fire with his own strength. Already weakened by the constant battle against the pylon's pull, Greyfax's hold on his mind snapped. But she wasn't finished. As her malediction faded, she fired her condemner bolter. Shells glanced off Abaddon's armor, but he resumed his advance towards Celestine. A rush of bayonets blocked his path. The Cadian 8th was determined to protect their saint, even at the cost of their lives. They died by the dozen, hacked apart as Abaddon pressed forward. Their sacrifice bought Celestine precious moments. The chamber shuddered as the nodal pylon flared again. Archmagos Call, seeding war mode functions to his secondary and tertiary consciousnesses, interrogated the data streams from his surviving servitors. It was working. The impossible was happening. The Cadian pylon fields, dormant for millennia, were pushing back the Eye of Terror's warped embrace. Demons lost their foothold in real space, cast back into the void by the pylon's black light, leaving only the bodies of their victims behind. Above, navigators lost their bearings as the Cadian gate, long a legend of becalmed warp tides, grew still. Phalanx's layered void shields collapsed as their immaterium connections faded. Teleport relays flickered, their transit corridors dissolving. From Phalanx's strategium, Commodore Treveau received the reports, wondering what it all meant. Chaos cruisers broke cover from the Will of Eternity's debris field, driving for the Black Fleet's big guns. Trevo's instinct screamed of danger, but his conscious mind saw none. He watched and waited for new data. Abaddon stood like an immovable rock. Amidst a river of flesh and bone, Drachnien carving a bloody swath with every strike. The despoiler and the wounded saint became the battle's focus. The Chaos Terminators of the Black Legion rejoined their master, only to face renewed fire from hot-shot laser guns. The Vostroyan 21 were torn apart by power-armoured Chosen. The stalemate continued, bloody enough to please Khorne if the Lord of Battles could peer through the growing dead zone of the pylon field. Slowly the northern flank turned as the Black Legion was driven back by the massed fire of Khorne's maniples. Greyfax rejoined the embattled storm forces, her orders laced with unambiguous threats. More afraid of the grim Inquisitor than the Black Legion's guns, the Eagles advanced. Taking command of a Kazakin platoon, Creed led another charge across the bloody ground. The Lord Castellan knew he couldn't match Abaddon in combat, but the Astra Militarum's way was to overwhelm with numbers. Trazin the Infinite watched from a rocky perch, aware that history unfolded before him. His taste for glory had faded, replaced by the urge to claim a trinket from the momentous hour. Metal fingers toyed with a tesseract labyrinth, its unfathomable dimensions fit to carry a single trophy from Cadia. What should that trophy be? A stray culverin blast rocked Trazin's perch, and he moved to safer ground. The tesseract would wait. Whatever his prize, its value would only increase as victory tipped one way or the other. Creed aimed his pistol, sending a laser burst through a Chaos Terminator's cracked eyepiece. A gout of warp-tainted promethium immolated a file of Kazakin. A dark shape loomed through the flames, eyes burning like coals. The talon of Horus roared, obliterating the rest of Creed's escort. The air was thick with screams, gunfire, and Black Legion oaths. Creed searched for allies but found only the dead. "Cadia stands!" Creed shouted, but no one joined his cry. Mocking laughter cut through the cacophony. Creed fired at Abaddon, one shot wounding his brow, others deflecting off his armor. "Cadia is dead!" thundered Abaddon. "Its doom is already here." The lightning claw lashed out, and Creed fell among the dead, blood oozing from a ravaged arm. His pistols were gone, one cast aside, the other slipping from his bloodied hand. Yet he felt no fear, only defiance. "Cadia lives while one of its soldiers fights on." Crackling talons closed around Creed's neck, lifting him effortlessly. "I set this world's fate in motion long before I arrived. Your games with the pylons only show the folly of pride." Creed clawed at the talons with his one good hand, but they were like stone. "But now," Abaddon rumbled, "the corpse bride has fled. Cadia's will is broken. The Imperium will follow. You are the last to die by my hand. Take solace in that this world will soon follow you." Abaddon drew Creed close, choking off his attempts to speak. "Cadia has fallen." Abaddon's grip tightened, Creed's vertebrae grinding together. As darkness closed in, he knew only shame. Cadia had stood proud for 10,000 years, only to fall under his watch. The humiliation of failed duty was worse than death. A roar of pain dragged Creed from the darkness. A golden figure pale as death stood behind Abaddon, her sword thrust into his spine. The talons released, and Creed fell. "The Emperor protects," Celestine whispered. Abaddon staggered back from Celestine as her blade tore from his flesh. The wound seethed as if aflame. It had been millennia since he had been hurt so grievously, and his spirit boiled with the need for revenge. But as the Cadian 8th Regiment surged to reclaim their beloved general, Abaddon realized he had no time for pride. The last vestiges of the warp were retreating before the pylon's arcane energies. If he were to escape, it had to be now. Reluctantly, his eyes never leaving Celestine, Abaddon gave the order to withdraw. As the vengeful spirit's teleport anchors engaged, The warrior Abaddon once was acknowledged the feat Cadia's defenders had managed. They had lost, though they did not yet know it, but they had also won. He had sought to break Cadia's spirit, sending the vanquished souls of its garrison screaming into the warp. He had not done so. Before the defenders' incredulous eyes, azure lightning crackled across the nodal cavern, and the surviving warriors of the Black Legion faded into nothingness. Creed angrily pulled away from the medic attempting to treat his hand, blinking away after images as the implications sank in. "I set this world's fate in motion before I even made planetfall," Abaddon had said. Creed wished he could dismiss the words as bravado, but his heavy heart knew otherwise. The void in Greyfax's mind grew larger, black and hungry against the red rage of her thoughts. Her weapons fell from numbed hands. She knew that yielding to it meant embracing oblivion, but the temptation was there. She staggered and sought to right herself before one of her bodyguard could assist. A hand seized Greyfax's shoulder and steadied her. Not a tempestuous scion, but Celestine. "Endure," said the saint. "It will not be forever." Greyfax lurched away, the suddenness of the motion shooting fresh spikes of pain through her mind. "Touch me not, witch!" Celestine's lips curled into a supercilious smile. "If I am a witch, why did you save me? I struck at another. It's not the same. Or perhaps the Emperor's hand guided you, as it guides me. A miracle?" The throbbing pain made the disdain easier. "Some call them so." "There are no miracles," spat Greyfax. "Only delusions. I will break your heresy. You will beg for death." The void in her mind pulsed. Again she staggered. Again Celestine caught her. "We shall see," said Celestine, letting go of the Inquisitor's shoulder and walking away. As the battle ceased, Archmagos Call's first thought was to recheck the pylon nodal grid's function. Finding it satisfactory, he secured from war mode and took inventory of his remaining forces. Greyfax shook with the effort of keeping her soul centered as the warp vacuum sought to claim it. Trazyn slipped the Tesseract labyrinth beneath his cloak, regretfully acknowledging that Ezekiel Abaddon would not grace his collection. At least not that day. As for Celestine, she stared upward through the ruined cavern roof into the starlit skies beyond. Her manner that of one who already knew what would happen next. On the surface, thunderhawks of the Crimson Slaughter and warped dropships of the traitor legions braved the Imperial defenders' fire, retrieving Dark Brothers and demon engines. The cultists and heretic citizenry, never more than fodder to weary Cadia's guns, were abandoned to their fate. Torgaradon rallied what remained of the Imperial fists on Cadia. Scarcely a score of battle brothers from the Third Company still fought, some through horrendous wounds. Of the First Company, only Sergeant Furan remained. Garadon noted the irony. The Third had been on phalanx because they were considered too inexperienced to join the chapter's crusade of vengeance. Those who remained had nothing more to prove, assuming they survived what came next. In contrast, Marshal Amalrich's Black Templars harried the retreating traitors, slaughtering the crew of one dropship before they could take flight and bringing another two down with missile fire. Even discounting Amalric's efforts, not all the Black Legion arrived safely at their destination. Caught in the turbulent currents of the warp, scores were torn apart or scattered as monomolecular dust across Cadia's atmosphere. But Abaddon survived, bloody and consumed with fury at his failure. From the vengeful spirit's strategium, he sounded the knell of Cadia's doom. Deep within the will of eternity's debris cloud, warpsmiths heard Abaddon's order. Across the largest fragment of debris, a mass of ancient stone the size of a small moon, banks of plasma drives roared to life. The Blackstone fortress's corpse shuddered as the engines fought to overcome its orbital inertia. Then, slowly at first but with ever-increasing speed, the ungainly missile broke orbit and roared planetward. Across the Black Fleet, plasma drives blazed as soon as the last dropships were aboard, pulling away from the atmosphere at whatever speed their captains could muster. As the vengeful spirit led the exodus, Abaddon beheld Cadia one last time. For 10,000 years that world had been as much his foe as the warriors that garrisoned its fortresses. But nothing defied the will of chaos forever. Nothing defied his will forever. Loosing a peal of dark laughter, Abaddon decanted a draught of brulquine into a chalice fashioned from the skull of Fabius Bile's clone of Horus, and toasted the death of one ancient foe with the remains of another. Aboard Phalanx, Commodore Treveau finally understood the Chaos cruiser's purpose within the debris cloud and ordered the battle station's batteries to engage the improvised missile. But in death, the Blackstone fortress resisted Phalanx's fire as it had failed to do in life. A section of the drivetrain went dark beneath the bombardment, but by then Cadia's gluttonous gravity well had seized the plunging Blackstone. All Treveau could do was broadcast a warning to those on the planet's surface. The Blackstone wreckage plunged, its outer edge blazing red with atmospheric friction, but the will of eternity had been forged to withstand fiercer fires than nature could provide. Though the last warpsmiths perished, their shelters burned away by Cadia's wrath, the main body plunged on, a bolt of flaming brimstone cast from Abaddon's dark hand. All upon the planet's surface heard the Blackstone's approach. Its soul-wrenching onset screeched through the quickening winds, its presence disrupting the complex web of thermals and weather patterns across the beleaguered planet. On the continent of Cadia Tertius, half a world away from the slaughter of the Elysian fields, the defenders of scattered imperial garrisons deemed too insignificant for Abaddon's attention beheld the Blackstone's approach as a pinprick of fire amidst shrieking skies. At first, it was taken for a void ship's reactor going critical in orbit, but as moments passed and the fireball grew larger, it became clear that this light heralded a far greater disaster. Winds howling, the artificial meteor impacted Cadia. Cadia trembled as unimaginable forces tore it from its age-old orbit. The survivors clinging to the ruins of Cadia Tertius barely had time to scream. Those at the impact site perished first, superheated wind roaring in their ears, before it seared flesh from bone and reduced bone to scattered ash. The remnant of the Blackstone fortress struck, gouging a crater hundreds of miles wide. Mountains crumbled to dust, seas evaporated into plumes of steam, and continental plates groaned and shifted under titanic forces not seen since Cadia first cooled from the cosmic void. The tremors spread, heralded by tidal waves and screaming particulate winds. Coastal bastions that had survived bombardment and siege drowned beneath the unnatural tide, ripped from their foundations and dragged beneath the squalling seas. The island of Ranstorn vanished entirely, its shell-ravaged landing field swallowed by the waves. 1,000 miles inland on Cadia Secundus, the enduring spires of Casavark at last fell, smashed apart by waters of the Caducard Sea as the tidal shelves buckled. Forests ancient when mankind first settled, Cadia burned away in moments, crustal platelets shattered and split, the world's molten lifeblood boiling forth. Long-dormant volcanoes flared to life along the Rosvar Mountains, pyroclastic flows consuming everything in their path. The great killing fields of Tyrok, where Creed ascended to Lord Castellan, split asunder and vanished into magma-lit gloom, swallowed by the world's torment. At the Elysian fields, half a world away from the impact site, the roar of winds and dark onrush of particulate clouds that blocked out the sun were seen and heard. The clever sought cover among the pylons and ruined war machines. The slow-witted perished, torn apart by the vaporized bones of Cadia. Prayers of battle sisters and chaos cultists alike were snatched away by the planet's dying breath, unheard by any deity or saint. In the nodal cavern, the ceiling cracked wider, raining boulders on Creed's bloodied victors. The winds grew, hurling tanks across the pylon fields, crushing those who had sought shelter beneath them. Ancient pylons lost their grip on the bedrock, toppling like petrified trees. The pylon field's beam of dark light flickered as the monoliths fell. The retreat of the immaterium faltered, then reversed. The storm raged for solar minutes that seemed like eternities, then fell away into hurricane winds. They blew over a world forever altered. The continent of Cadia Tertius was gone, obliterated by fire and drowned beneath howling seas. The Crean fault, bane of Cadia Tertius since the Age of Strife, ruptured one last time, splitting the planetary crust apart. Cadia Primus was half-drowned, its forested mountainsides now isolated islands scattered across a new ocean. Cadia Secundus lay wreathed in fire, its continental plates sinking as the pressure of their neighbours forced them inward. None of it mattered. Cadia was already dead. But worse was to come. As aftershocks rippled through the dying rock, more pylons shattered against the dust-strewn tundra, not just at the Elysion fields, but also at Kazan, Trosk and Vorg. As the pylons fell, the nodal web stuttered, then withered entirely. The dark light beam, Call's spear into the heart of the Eye of Terror, flickered once more, then died. A new sound pealed through the howling winds. The dark laughter of gods too long denied their prize. The crimson maelstrom of the Eye of Terror pulsed anew, reaching out to embrace sundered Cadia. Call felt the nodal grid pull apart, the remaining pylons no match for the pressure of the resurgent immaterium. Through his third consciousness, he dimly acknowledged the screams and grinding of tortured rock. Then he focused all his attention on the task at hand. The Archmagos's secondary consciousness translated the alien whisper of the pylons into a static-filled flow of lingua technis. Gaps appeared in the Binharic equations, untranslatable fragments glowing with green fire. They hadn't been there before, confirming the growing instability of the grid. No, he would not fail, not after coming so close. As Call's tertiary mind approximated translation for the unfamiliar code, his primary consciousness tightened its grip, as if to hold together the grid by will alone. His optics scoured the shuddering cavern for any trace of Trazyn, but the Necron was nowhere to be seen. Curse him. And curse Veilwalker too, for setting him on this course. Failure changed nothing. Worse, it jeopardized the Pact. A 10,000-year Gaius now thrown into jeopardy by perfidious Xenos, rage overwhelmed the logic calculations of Call's trifold mind, passionless composure wilting beneath the realization of his folly. The pylons were not the Omnissiah's work, and yet, blinded by pride, he had sought to bind them to holy purpose. He had erred, seduced from the precepts of Mars by vainglory. Skeins of Binharic code slipped into dust beneath Call's grip. Equations breathed through his mind, more alien now than recognizable. He felt the nodal grid convulse, the last bindings falling away as critical pylons fell, a dark, cancerous presence flooding across Cadia's surface, rapacious, unstoppable. As the last Binharic skein slipped free of his grip, Call finally recognized his folly. The door he had sought to close forever had swung open wider than before. Trifold mind trembling, he disengaged from the dying grid. Cadia is lost, he breathed. Save for the presence of the pylons, the immaterium would have claimed Cadia long ago. The long-dead Necron artisans who set the pylon fields in Cadia's living rock could not have foreseen the Eye of Terror's cataclysmic birth, nor known the vital bulwark their works would become. But now, with the pylons' fall, the tendrils of the warp laid their first loving caress upon Cadian real space, and the demons of the dark gods spilled forth. These were not the flickering manifestations recently loosed upon the world, constantly challenged by the pylons' power. These were the servants of the ruinous powers, hale and whole, fed by the raw stuff of chaos. They first appeared amidst drowned Cadia Tertius, where the Blackstone fortress's demise had torn a rent in reality's veil through sheer loss of life. But as the Eye of Terror slipped its ancient bounds, the rifts multiplied, dragging the beleaguered world into the bowels of the immaterium. Dark laughter echoed across skies, still choked with particulate matter. Cadia's surviving psychers, freed at last from the tyranny of the pylons, came under new assault from the perils of the warp. Most were slain at the hand of former allies, their possessed bodies ripped apart by laser and bolt of fire as flesh reshaped into new and terrible forms. Only those with a will of iron held back the demons clawing at their thoughts, and only Greyfax found the strength of mind to repel them entirely. And yet in that darkest hour, hope was reborn. The restoration of the immaterium also saw the renewed ascension of Celestine and her Gemini superior. The light of the Emperor restored, she led the survivors out of the chamber and into the wasteland of the Elysian fields. None recognized the sight they beheld. Magma wended its sluggish path amidst the fallen pylons, consuming the bodies of the dead and their armaments of war. Sporadic fire rang out across the plains as the first demons clawed their way onto the war-torn fields. As the scant survivors of the Elysian fields converged, drawn like flare moths to Celestine's light, the Cadian 8th Regiment once again looked to Creed for leadership. For the first time since he had joined the White Shield so many standard years ago, none was forthcoming. The Lord Castellan looked out upon the ruin of his world, his Cadia, and knew only despair. Recognizing that Creed's mind now roamed distant fields, and determined not to allow authority to fall into Celestine's dubious hands, Greyfax seized command. Using what remained of the planetary Voxnet, she issued the evacuation order. Cadia had fallen. Even if it endured the physical trauma of the Blackstone's collision, the warp would soon claim it. Victory in the Imperium's name was worth the sacrifice of thousands, of millions, but the Inquisitor knew no victory could any longer be had on Cadia. Every living soul abandoned upon its sundered shores was but a sacrifice to the dark gods. Greyfax expected Celestine to challenge her order, to exhort Cadia to one last glorious stand. But the Golden Saint merely took wing north through the howling winds to carry her blade against the demons assailing the surviving Adepta Sororitas. Thus began the last exodus of Cadia. From across the globe they came, in landing craft and transport vessels barely fit to fly, plasma drives burning hard for the safety of Phalanx and the ragtag fleet sheltering in its shadow. Not all reached their destinations safely. Overburdened engines failed amidst the howling winds, condemning their cargo to stomach-lurching freefall until the oblivion of impact. Others were peeled apart by winged demons, or simply had their weakened hulls implode under the fantastic pressures. The Cadian 27th Regiment perished to the last man as their tetrarch. Heavy Landers pilots succumbed to warp-cast madness and ploughed the limping behemoth into the remains of the Tradus Mountains. Helldrakes and Harbingers, operating far from the trailing edge of the Black Fleet, risked the savage winds to spill more blood for the dark gods. Dogfights unfolded amid swirling dust storms as the last of the Imperial Fist's Stormhawk interceptors sought to clear the skies. Yet they were too few to keep the foe contained, and the evacuation fields of Elysion became shell-riddled mausoleums. Elsewhere, the evacuation was dogged by the panic of stampeding masses. Just as the immaterium came to consume Cadia, terror sought to devour its remaining populace. Some regiments kept their order. Others disintegrated into mindless mobs, clambering atop overloaded transports in their desperation to escape. At Casa Luton and Casa Gorsk, officers ordered their Kasakin to fire into the crowds, and disorder became full-blooded riot. At the Elysian fields, the evacuation became a fighting retreat, every transport a target for soul-hungry demons. In the north, Celestine's Adepta Sororitas slowly gave ground, but at a high cost to their foes. To the south, the tale was the same. The demons there were held by a ragged line of guardsmen, buttressed at either end by Garradon's Imperial Fists and the Black Templars of the Cruxis Crusade. Despite their heroism, it soon became clear to Greyfax that the evacuation fields would soon be overrun. Flight-worthy voidcraft were too few, and growing scarcer with each passing moment. Some would have to be sacrificed for the rest to escape. It was then that Creed at last roused himself from despair. The Lord Castellan's own would hold Cadia one last time, he decreed. They would buy the time needed, as Cadia ever had, with an offering of blood and bone. Orders were issued, their bleak consequence plain to all who heard, but the Cadian 8th Regiment did not blanch at the duty placed before them. There was not one amongst them who did not feel the cold hand of fear, but none broke ranks or attempted desertion. Creed was Cadia, but more than that, he was of the 8th. He had led the regiment safely through fire and death, where others had been consumed. There was not one amongst those ranks who did not owe the Lord Castellan their lives, and all accepted that the debt was due. As the last Imperial transport soared into the hellish skies, the 8th fought and died amongst the ruins of their world. The sisters of our martyred Lady and Marshal Amalrich's Black Templars were the last to depart, their blooded survivors crowding aboard transports sent from the Iron Revenant to reclaim the Knights of House Taranis. Greyfax departed with them, her suspicious eye ever upon Celestine. But as the landing thrusters flared, the Inquisitor thought she heard a bellowed cry, clear and proud over the howling winds and the roar of cannons. It was a deep voice, bowed by the horrors of war, but not broken, defiant to the last. "Cadia stands!" Creed waved his maimed hand in the air, signalling his troops and bellowing to be heard over the fury of the wind. "Fall back! Fall back!" With a shudder, the Cadian line shrank towards the evacuation fields. The winds rose, stirring the dust storm to new heights. Suddenly Creed was alone. A flame-chased shadow passed overhead, the cog-toothed skull of the Adeptus Mechanicus emblazoned on its flanks. Las fire lanced from its prow, provoking demonic screams from deeper within the dust storm. Then engines roared, and the transport thundered skywards. The last transport. Cadia was now little more than a graveyard, haunted by the stubborn and the dead. Creed stumbled. Despite the medic's valiant labours, his wounds still bled. He felt his strength ebbing as his lifeblood seeped into the greatcoat's fabric. One last effort, then he'd rest. One last effort. The storm parted, not before a demon, but a metal giant in a scaled cloak. The wind snatched away Creed's hurried shot. Light glittered upon the figure's upraised palm, iridescent polygons billowing in a hypnotic dance. "Ursaka E. Creed." The giant's words slammed down like tombstones. "This need not be your end. Eternity awaits." The giant's laughter followed Creed into darkness, and so a diminished fleet of battle-worn vessels and exhausted souls departed Cadia's orbit, heading for the system's edge. The Eye of Terror, no longer contained, spilled from its ancient bounds, a crimson trail of roiling flame bleeding through the Cadian gate and into the galaxy. There was no jubilation aboard the fleet, no sense of victory, despite the odds endured. Too many had perished before Greyfax issued her evacuation order, and even then only a small fraction of Cadia's surviving outposts had heard the desperate voxcast. At the inception of the 13th Black Crusade, Cadia had been a world of some 850 million souls. Scarce 3 million now sought salvation from Abaddon's forces. The legend of Cadia might yet endure on another distant world, but now its bloodlines teetered on the brink. From the outset, warp travel was deemed unwise, the starship's navigators unable to see safe routes through the immaterium. With the fall of the pylons, the navigable corridor of the Cadian gate was collapsing in upon itself. There was no surer way to embrace oblivion than to risk those turbulent tides. So it was that the fleet's plasma drives were pushed to, and sometimes beyond, their limits. Once more under Tor Garadon's command, Phalanx took the lead, the threat of its guns driving traitor cruisers from the evacuation's path. Behind came the battle-scarred vessels of the Imperial Navy, and those few civilian void craft that had survived Cadia's fall. Last came the Mechanicus vessels of Belisarius' call. The adepts of Mars had come late to the Cadian war zone, and their ships were the least damaged as a consequence. As the evacuee fleet crawled beyond the horizon of Cadia's gravity well, this changed. Inured to the dangers of travel within the Eye of Terror's corona, Abaddon's most opportunistic captains now swarmed in relentless pursuit. The void blazed with light as waves of corsairs braved the Adeptus Mechanicus broadsides to claim prizes amongst the retreating fleet. All perished, their atoms scattered across the collapsing Cadian gate by the unfaltering fire of Call's fleet, but few without leaving their mark. 20 solar hours into the retreat, the Dictator-class cruiser Hand of Satariel was crippled by enemy fire, to the loss of all hands and 10,000 souls. In the next 10 solar hours, 2 frigates and a light cruiser met the same fate. Call bore the losses stoically, interpreting them as penance for his hubris on Cadia, and exhorted his servitor crews to further effort. 40 solar hours into the retreat, the plasma drives failed on the agri-hauler Pride of St. Seraphos. Faced with the choice of risking the whole fleet for the sake of those crammed like a slaughter herd into the hauler's hold, Garadon took aboard what sparse transport craft escaped the wreck, but reluctantly abandoned the Pride to the enemy. The captains of the Emperor's Wrath and Dominus Victor, appalled at Garadon's pragmatism, defied his orders and went to the Pride's aid. Their choice proved noble but foolish. Scarce half of the Cadian soldiers aboard the Pride of St. Seriphos had been taken aboard the two battleships when the leading edge of the Black Fleet caught up with them. Emperor's Wrath died without ever disengaging its docking beams, torn apart by a traitor's broadside. Dominus Victor broke away, fires blazing all along its starboard flank, but its plasma drives roaring at full force. With fortune and perseverance, it might even have regained the safety of Call's rear guard, had not its captain been slain during the fight. In panic, his subordinate ordered an emergency warp jump, even knowing the dangers such a course presented. What heading he ordered was a mystery, for Dominus Victor never emerged from the immaterium, the panic of those within a delicacy for thirsting Slaanesh. Thus another 250,000 fell to the Black Fleet's guns, a tenth of whom had perished through naught save misguided compassion. The red orb of Cadia was barely a pinprick of light against the void. Scarce a solar day had passed, and it was already succumbing to the Eye of Terror's baleful influence. It would make a fine demon world, Abaddon decided, if the tectonic forces he'd set loose did not see it destroyed first. It mattered little either way. After 10 millennia of preparation, the Crimson Path was now ready for him to tread. The only question was whether it would bring him to terror before it split the galaxy asunder. Again, it mattered little either way. He turned from the viewport as the Strategium's doors rumbled open. Zaraphiston advanced across the rusted deck, the clawed foot of his warp stave clicking against the decaying mesh. "My lord Abaddon, why do we not pursue?" Abaddon frowned, leaning forward on the obsidian table that separated him from Zaraphiston. It was a bold question, too bold for the usually obsequious sorcerer. "The Loyalists are beaten. Let the curs of the fleet snap at their heels. They are worth no more than that." The Chaos Sorcerer moved to the viewport, his gaze fixed on the red orb of Cadia, transfixed by the Crimson Path. "But one vessel carries something precious," Abaddon sneered. "There is nothing of any value aboard Phalanx." Zaraphiston's third eye blinked and his lips curled into a knowing smile. "I do not speak of Phalanx. The Arc Mechanicus, the relic that lies within its stasis hold." A sense of unease prickled at Abaddon's thoughts. "What have you seen? What have the auguries told you?" Zaraphiston spoke a name, one Abaddon had long put from his thoughts. It seemed impossible, but such words had as much weight now as they did when Horus first set foot on Davin. Lost to sudden rage, the despoiler brought his fist down on the table, shattering it into pieces. Zaraphiston stepped back, his smile fading. In an effort to avoid further losses, Garradon slowed Phalanx's pace, not wanting to place unnecessary strain on vessels already overburdened. The least spaceworthy ships were brought aboard Phalanx's foredeck hangars, their hatches sealed tight to prevent the curious or treacherous from entering the battle fortress proper. Having almost lost Phalanx to an invasion mere weeks earlier, Garradon refused to take any chances now, especially as the fury of its guns was the only thing keeping Abaddon's capital ships at a respectful distance. Still, the losses mounted, fatigue now as deadly a foe as the corsairs of Abaddon's fleet. Sleep was but a memory, banished by the chems consumed with rations during the long hours at battle stations. 2 days after Dominus Victor's disappearance, mistakes by a weary gunnery crew aboard the Toxra Clavius saw the destroyer's superstructure blown apart, setting the void ship adrift. Within hours of that disaster, a Primaris Psyker aboard Hades' 12th succumbed to the whispers in his waking dreams. The emergent keeper of secrets rampaged across 3 decks before the white shields of the Cadian 79th Regiment, now as veteran in thought and deed as any of their comrades, brought it down with unrelenting lasfire. Even after the demon was purged, Garradon ordered Hades' 12th quarantined from the rest of the fleet. That status remained until Call's Arc Mechanicus, acting under Katarina Greyfax's orders, blasted the destroyer to twisted scrap to prevent any possibility of the heresy within spreading to others. 112 hours into the retreat, as the demon world once known as Cadia finally succumbed to its fiery death throes, the evacuation fleet approached the outer orbit of Clasus, Casa Holm's icy moon. Phalanx's navigators at last pronounced the tides of the warp clear enough to attempt travel. Of the 29 void ships that had left Cadia, 16 remained, bearing just over 2.5 million souls between them. It was at that moment that the capital ships of the Black Fleet lost their apparent fear of Phalanx's guns. They dropped out of warp transit just inside weapons range, 10 of the Black Fleet's mightiest vessels, the vengeful Spirit at their head. A mix of grand cruisers and battleships, they drove hard for the evacuation fleet's Adeptus Mechanicus rearguard, eschewing the oblique advance favoured by captains seeking to minimise their losses. Abaddon had come, and hell rode upon his heels. Panicked combursts crackled across Phalanx's strategium, cut off one by one as the vessels of the evacuee fleet slipped into the relative safety of the warp. Cruisers, heavy transports, freighters, mining scows, all departed the Cadian system for the last time, grateful to have escaped Cadia's doom, but fearful of the future that lay ahead. Garadon had time for a single heartfelt curse before Phalanx followed, its countdown too far advanced for safe interruption. With the yawning and creaking of strained metal, the mighty battle fortress let slip the anchors of real space and plunged into the immaterium. Cawl's fleet, their departure deliberately staggered to guard against any vessel being left stranded, was alone. The first shells burst amongst Cawl's formation. Fired at such extreme range, accuracy was impossible. Thus, it was only the most damnable ill fortune that saw one shell explode against the Arch Mechanicus's aft shields. The detonation knocked 2 of the vessel's plasma drives out of alignment. Far worse, it crippled the Iron Revenant's Jella fields. For Cawl and all aboard his ship, there could be no escape into the warp. Consumed with fear at the prospect of losing his sacred cargo, Cawl brought the Iron Revenant about to an evasion heading. As their flagship sought to make its escape, the remainder of the Adeptus Mechanicus fleet swung around into blockade formation, their captains accepting without question the sacrifice required of them. The last surviving interceptors boiled from their hangars. The first salvos roared silently away into the void, raking the oncoming cruisers. Of all Cawl's fleet, only the Arch Mechanicus could match one of Abaddon's vessels broadside to broadside, and even then, the Iron Revenant's weaponry was but a pale shadow of the vengeful spirits. But the directness of the Chaos Warfleet's approach offered initial fire superiority. Salvo after salvo pounded the traitor vessels, overloading shields and buckling armor. Servitor crews labored with mechanical efficiency, loading and firing without trace of the fatigue that plagued unaugmented crews. Explosions flared in the ever-closing gap between the two fleets as the outnumbered interceptors clashed with Helldrakes and Hell-Talons. Prow lances flared, and liquefied adamantium ran like tears across the armoured flanks of the Adeptus Mechanicus warships. The Sanctus Malefic, prow reduced to a torn and pockmarked ruin by torpedo salvos, and its strategium crew dead, peeled away on the whim of jammed rudders. But even had twice the vessels barred Abaddon's path, there would have been no halting that advance. The captain of Strokor's Fist, with Auspex arrays blinded by shells, lost his resolve for a direct assault and ordered his grand cruiser to engage in long-range volleys instead. Apocalyptia and the Vengeful Spirit, though battered, reached Cawl's line of cruisers. The initial Chaos broadside struck with thunderous force. Arxes Phobos melted like ice before a flame, its shields and armor boiling into space moments before a destabilized plasma reactor consumed it from within. Xanthos and Everos Mondus endured the first raking salvos, only to fall to the Chaos cruisers that followed. Cerebos went down fighting, trading broadsides with a grand cruiser twice its size before a final salvo broke its back. Stellaris Mons, its targeting systems destroyed by cannon fire, set a collision course for its tormentor. The detonation of its plasma reactor shattered the Chaos battleship's drive section, leaving it adrift among the debris. Alpha Scion, with its interceptor screen shredded by the Black Fleet's fighters, was overrun by assault boats. As its captain ordered a last stand, Black Legion boarding parties ripped through the cruiser's bulkheads, slaughtering the bridge crew. One by one, the ships of the Adeptus Mechanicus fleet went dark or detonated in flares of plasma. These sacrifices were not in vain. Each moment bought was time for the Iron Revenant's damaged Gela fields to be repaired. But the Arch Mechanicus quickly lost ground before the Vengeful Spirit. which alone ignored the blockade and pursued its fleeing prize. Abaddon ordered the battleship's prow guns silenced, not wanting their recoil to slow the chase. Bit by bit, the battleship closed the distance. Recognizing the inevitability of being overtaken by the vengeful spirit, Call pushed the Iron Revenant systems beyond their limits. Superheated steam roared from cracked coolant pipes, klaxons sounded across the drive decks, and pressure manifolds exceeded safety thresholds. It made little difference. No matter how much additional acceleration Call coaxed from the Iron Revenant's engines, the vengeful spirit closed too quickly. Within minutes, the battleship would draw level, and the broadsides would commence. Call processed the probabilities of survival repeatedly, each time seeing vanishingly small odds. Curiosity had led Call to Cadia. Pride had held him there. Now the Iron Revenant would be lost, along with its precious cargo. He had failed. "Increase drive threshold by 17%, Call commanded. The Strategium shuddered as the Iron Revenant's crew enacted his orders. Greyfax needed no telepathy to understand that Call knew the futility of his command. The Iron Revenant was doomed. But she would never have known of his secret had she not peered into his mind. An obligation, a sense of duty unfulfilled, drove the Archmagos, an imperative so closely guarded she could only see its shape, not its detail. "We cannot outrun this fate," Celestine intoned. Marshal Amalrich growled low, a warning in his tone. "Would you have us offer our necks to the despoiler without a fight?" Celestine turned from the viewport. "I beheld this in a dream, a river of blood among the stars. The harder we struggle, the more certain our fate. We must find another way." Greyfax felt old anger rise at those words. "There is no salvation in your heresy. If—" She fell silent at Call's impatient gesture. "Necessity considers all answers, however improbable their provenance." "She is a heretic," Greyfax interjected. Greyfax fell silent, reminding herself that Call's artificial lifespan far predated the Inquisition from which her authority sprang. She couldn't take his obedience for granted. "A bold accusation," hissed Call, "for one whose blood seethes with Necron artifice. Do not deny it. I perceive the nanomachines writhing beneath your skin." At once, Greyfax felt the mood in the Strategium shift. Amalric's expression darkened with fresh suspicion, reminding her of the Black Templar's unpredictable zeal. "I remain uncorrupted," Call observed her thoughtfully. "So you say. I can even free you from their grasp. But for that, we must first survive." He shifted his attention to Celestine. "What else did your vision show? What must we do?" The Saint indicated Clasus on the view screen. "We will find salvation within the ice, and then our crusade will begin anew." Amalric nodded. "Your crusade, lady, but we will follow while our strength remains." Disgusted, Greyfax turned away. The Celestinian crusade? The very thought of it made her skin crawl. So the Iron Revenant set course for Clasus, the Ice Moon, under Celestine's direction. Stressed plasma drives brought the Arc Mechanicus around on a new bearing, the motion affording the Iron Revenant one furious, unanswered broadside at the pursuing vengeful spirit. The Black Fleet battleship, taken unawares by the sudden change of course, had no opportunity to evade the swarm of torpedoes that sped toward its prow. Shields collapsed, armor crumpled. The prow cannons were blasted free of their mountings, and the colossal 8-pointed star that served as the vengeful spirit's figurehead was reduced to mangled scrap. But that battleship had survived the siege of the Emperor's palace. It had borne wounds far greater than any the Iron Revenant could inflict. It would not go quietly. Whatever salvation awaited the Iron Revenant on Clasus, Celestine's guidance now put the ship within range of the vengeful spirit's main guns. Abandoning the head-on course, Abaddon closed obliquely, his starboard batteries blazing as they gnawed at the Arc Mechanicus's hull. Unable to outpace the battleship, the Iron Revenant did the only thing it could. It endured, meeting the vengeful spirit's fury with its own. The two warships pounded at each other for over an hour, the pale disk of Clasus growing ever larger. The Iron Revenant's macro cannons crashed back on their bearings, unseated by enemy fire. Torpedo tubes spat their last. Hundreds perished in every broadside, their bodies thickening the Arc Mechanicus's causeways or expelled by violent decompression to bob along the mangled outer hull. Aboard the vengeful Spirit, traitors flooded to their assault claws along passageways crushed by the Iron Revenant's broadsides. The despoiler meant to claim his prize for himself, or else see it burn to nothing in Clasus's thin atmosphere. As the battleship shuddered with one final broadside, silencing the Iron Revenant's last interceptor batteries, the Dreadclaws screamed across the void. As the garbled reports of boarding parties reached the Iron Revenant's strategium, Call knew the ship was lost, but it had served its purpose. The dueling vessels were now deep in Clasus orbit, and the relative shelter of the moon's swirling blizzards was but minutes away. Ceding command of the dying Ark to the crew, Call headed deeper into the ship and began the process of unsealing the stasis vault. As the Adeptus Sororitas made for the undamaged portside hangars, Marshal Amalric declared his battle brothers would ensure the Iron Revenant died fighting. Greyfax argued against this course. To her mind, Call was already half under Celestine's spell, and the Inquisitor wanted allies of her own close to hand. Still, Amalric was resistant. The Marshal's pride chafed from the long retreat, and only the presentation of the Inquisitorial seal bent him to Greyfax's will. So it was that a flight of transport spiraled planetwards, bearing their weary cargo. They used the dying Iron Revenant as cover against the vengeful Spirit and the last of the doomed Ark's fighter craft as escort. As the Iron Revenant finally began to break apart, and the first Helldrake screamed in pursuit, the fleeing convoy vanished into the howling snowstorms. The blizzards of frozen Clasus may have obscured Abaddon's pursuit, but they did not end it. Enraged that his quarry might escape, the despoiler launched every flight-worthy vessel at his command, scouring the surface for any trace of his prey. Thus Call's trek across the glaciers became a fighting retreat, with survivors scrambling for cover each time a Helldrake shrieked overhead. Such precautions were born more of hope than strategy. There was no hiding the modified Triaros armoured conveyor that carried Call's precious reliquary, or the lumbering knights of House Tyrannus. But fortune held for the first few hours of planetfall. On they trudged, the Adeptus Sororitas following Celestine's holy light, each as unfaltering as she, though the living saint offered no clue about their path or purpose. The survivors of the Capic Eagles, flesh blackening with frostbite, were determined to be as resolute as the Battle Sisters. Inquisitor Greyfax and Marshal Amalric's Black Templars brought up the rear, each battle brother grim as death in the teeming blizzard. Call followed Celestine unfalteringly through the swirling snows, growing increasingly certain that the living saint knew his purpose, the burden he had carried for so long. Perhaps this had been Veilwalker's intent in directing him to Cadia. Not to unlock the secrets of the pylons, but for Celestine to lead him to fulfill the pact he had made with a Primarch 10,000 years ago. The living saint was a vessel of the Omnissiah's will, his purpose hers. Step by step, Call's resolve returned. He told himself that his path from Eriad 6 had been a pilgrimage, a test. He chastised himself for ever doubting the Omnissiah's purpose and pressed on. Then the snows stopped. The Helldrakes came again soon after, their strafing runs leaving trails of dead and dying across the glacier. 2 of the demon craft perished without even touching the frozen ground, blown out of the skies by crack missiles. A third tore apart a squad of Tempestus scions and ripped a chunk of armor from the Triaros before Call's axe split its warp metal skull asunder. From that moment on, there was no silence, no reprieve. Alerted to their quarry's presence, the Black Legion warbands converged upon the glacier. Running battles broke out upon the snowfields, the thunderous echoes of one skirmish scarcely fading before another began. Havocs rained fire from the mountainous heights. Raptors struck from cloudless skies, their discordant battle cries further shredding the nerves of men and women weary from weeks of strife. Bikers prowled the flanks, roaring into weapons range only when they believed their quarry's attention was elsewhere. All perished. Seraphim swept the crags clear, the backwash of Promethean melting ice formed centuries before. Laser gun volleys cleared the skies of raptors, The pounding cannons of Tyrannus Knights purged the icy fields of the despoilers' bikers. But there were always more, their numbers ever replenishing, while the ranks of Call's escort grew thinner with each passing hour. As more succumbed to their wounds, the survivors drew closer to the Triaros conveyor. Its projected void shields provided some protection for those nearest, and, inexplicably, every Imperial soul felt it their duty to protect whatever was inside. Greyfax's psychic interrogation of her wounded foes revealed they were surrounded, and the noose was tightening. But there was nothing more to be done other than keep moving, perhaps breaking out of the encirclement to buy a few more hours of respite. Celestine led them ever higher into the jagged mountains. Tempesta's scions fell dead amidst the snows, skin blackened and eyes frozen. By this time Greyfax had abandoned her attempts at questioning Celestine's purpose. Though redoubtable, the Inquisitor did not have the gene-forged fortitude of the Adeptus Astartes, and needed all her breath for the endless march. Still the Black Legion pursued, the roaring plasma drives of their dropships echoing through the mountain passes. As the mismatched company reached a ridgeline, Greyfax caught sight of a column of traitor tanks, thick as beetles in the valley below. When Call's escort reached the sunken gate of some ancient structure, its surface smoothed flat by driving winds, they found it held against them by a sorcerous cabal. Another bloody skirmish saw the gateway claimed, but the smoke clouds rising from the wreck of a predator revealed the company's position as clearly as any signal beacon. Before the last sorcerer fell, the roar of engines echoed from the valley. "What do you see?" asked Celestine, moving to stand beside the Inquisitor on the ridge. It had to be a rhetorical question, Greyfax decided. No eye could have missed the spreading stain of Black Legion tanks across the glacier. "I see our death," she answered sourly. "No," said Celestine. "Salvation awaits us." Stilling her chattering teeth, Greyfax turned angrily away from the ridgeline. "Your lies are wasted on me, idolatress." As ever, Celestine seemed unoffended. "You serve the Emperor. You trust the Emperor. Why can you not believe his hand guides me?" Greyfax drew closer. "I don't believe anything guides you. You're a heretic preying on the credulous. I should have let the despoiler kill you. Were you not surrounded by your acolytes, I'd kill you now." Celestine smiled. "Then I should kill you first while I can?" Greyfax squared her shoulders. "Yes." The smile faded. "He has a plan for you too, Katerina. I have seen it." So saying, Celestine took wing. Katerina Greyfax returned to her place in the procession of fools. But though her mood remained bleak, a small corner of her soul took heart from Celestine's words. Marshal Amalrich detailed half of his surviving battle brothers to remain behind and guard the pass. He argued that the pursuit they faced was now no mere rabble of scattered warbands, but a column armed and arrayed for battle. Better for a few of their number to hold and delay that pursuit, buying time for the others to proceed. Volunteers were sought and found, and Emperor's champion Garan led his battle brothers away down the dreary slopes, knowing that the next battle would also be their last. Celestine's path wound ever higher into the peaks. As night fell, the echoes of battle faded from the slopes below. The Black Templars who remained with Call knelt briefly in the snow, Amalrich's deep voice leading a warrior's chant of benediction for their fallen brothers. Then they moved on, unburdened by grief or guilt. By dawn, the snow began again, shielding Call's company from prying eyes, but also slowing their progress to a near standstill. They forged onwards, though at a painfully slow pace, and even Celestine's light seemed to dim. As the pale sun reached its zenith, the roar of engines pierced the slackening snows. Land raiders clawed their way across the lower slopes, their teeth tracks biting deep into the permafrost in pursuit. At Celestine's urging, Call's company pressed on. The Knights of House Tyrannus rained fire on their pursuers, comrades falling back by squads, each giving covering fire for those that followed, expending their last precious ammunition in the wild climb for the summit. The heavy snowdrifts took their toll on the Triaros tracks, slowing progress to a crawl. Call's spirits, restored by faith during the long climb, wavered anew as he sought to soothe the conveyor's wounded machine spirit. Hellbrutes bellowed mad praises, and the wail of the raptor's voxcasters set the air screaming. The assault ramp of the nearest land raider crashed down, and Abaddon strode forth, his Chaos Terminators at his back. The despoiler's presence was too much for the last of the Capic Eagles. Frozen and weary beyond reckoning, they fled uphill, all discipline forgotten. As the despoiler advanced through the snows, Call took his place at the forefront of his dwindling company, ready to die for a pact that seemed doomed to be unfulfilled. Suddenly, the ice in front of Call exploded in a burst of dazzling light. Eldari jet bikes hissed over the icy crest, their shuriken cannons rasping death at the Black Legion. Trails of fractured light followed, vibrant colours dancing and reforming around leaping, pirouetting warriors. The crest, recently occupied by the fleeing scions, filled with graceful warriors armoured in myriad colours. Behind them came slender combat walkers, their strides rippling with grace and power, the searing light of their armament unanswerable. The Black Legion fell back before the Eldari onslaught. They had prepared for battle against a fractured and weary foe, half-beaten by cold and despair. Instead, they met an Ulthwé strike force, accompanied by witches of Comora, warriors of Bieltan, and Asuriani from other craft worlds. Abaddon charged into the maelstrom, bellowing for his warriors to follow. Those who did perished, sliced apart by dancing blades or shredded by razor-edged shuriken. Twice the despoiler led a charge toward the Triaros. Twice the Eldari hurled the Black Legion back from the crest. Through it all, Call and his company staggered deeper into the Xenos ranks until the crest was behind them. Ahead, nestled in a natural valley, stretched the elegant spires of a webway gate, its columns blazing with light. Celestine hovered above the portal's dancing energies, arms outspread in silent prayer. Call topped the crest and gazed down into the mustering war host. Subroutines drew archival data from storage, matching the shapes of Xenos armor to records salvaged from 1,000,000 conflicts across the galaxy. A data cluster from Port Demesnes confirmed the presence of the notorious Eldred Outrun. But as for the others, his analysis returned no firm conclusions. It was scarcely surprising. The Eldari were ever shifting, changing personality as freely as they changed masks. What did surprise Call was the motley nature of the Xenos assemblage. He could access no prior reports of so many disparate Eldari cultures fighting together as one. Two figures at the centre of the host were a true enigma. One, a female attired in an elaborate gown, appeared to be directing proceedings, moving with calm authority amid the swirling storm of colour. Beside her was a warrior in crimson, his raiment echoing both Craftworld aspect warrior armour and the crueler plate of the Comorite Dark Eldar pirates. Call found no record of its design, even in the deepest Mechanicus archives. With a flicker of light, a familiar figure appeared at Call's side, the patterns of her mask dancing with light. Veilwalker. "What is this?" Call asked. "Where are you taking us?" "Into the light of a new dawn." The Shadowseer tilted her head, as if confused by the question. "Unless you prefer to remain in the darkness." With an effort, the Archmagos ignored what he hoped was an attempt at humour. "The despoiler has a warship in orbit. You cannot hold them for long." "We will not have to." The patterns of Veilwalker's mask danced with new light. "The ending has passed. It is time for a new beginning. There is a parley to be struck if you have the courage." The Shadowseer cast a graceful hand towards the Eldari host. With but the merest hesitation, Call followed her into the future. Cadia was lost, and the 13th Black Crusade had finally achieved the victory sought by the Dark Gods for 10,000 years. But the war would continue. At the climax of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, the nascent Cicatrix Maledictum had nearly obliterated Cadia. With the great pylons toppled by Abaddon's victorious forces and the colossal warp storm of the Eye of Terror no longer contained, the planet fell prey to the relentless ravages of chaos, leaving it beyond repair. Yet, the neighbouring worlds and star systems remained resolute. Had Cadia not been renowned for its staunch resistance against overwhelming odds, it is likely that the surrounding planets would have capitulated or surrendered almost immediately. No ordinary world could withstand the horrifying, sanity-shattering armies that descended upon the Cadian Gate in such overwhelming numbers. Nevertheless, The broader systems of Cadia, Bellis Corona and Agrippina held their ground. Perhaps, as a seasoned warrior can inspire lesser men to heroic deeds, Cadia had motivated the worlds around it to defend every nation and city to the last. Perhaps the surviving soldiers of Cadia fueled the fight with their thirst for vengeance, or perhaps those battered by the storm fought simply to survive. Regardless of the reason, the defenders of the Cadian Gate resolved to uphold the virtues of their fallen central world, no matter the cost. In the chaos of outright war, the hordes of chaos began to turn on each other. Although they were victorious, their ultimate triumph remained unfulfilled. Rival warlords, both mortal and demonic, vied for the spoils of victories still pending. The Imperial defenders quickly seized upon each strategic blunder, for many were veterans of the battles on Cadia and knew how to provoke a fractious enemy into overextending. From discord arose destruction. Day by day, the Imperial forces reclaimed a semblance of control. Soon the war zone was contested once more, the relentless grip of chaos weakened by the sheer resolve of the Astra Militarum and the vengeful wrath of the Space Marines. Each new dawn saw the arrival of ships from the Great Exodus, survivors who had braved the Empyrean storms and lived to tell the tale. The fighting intensified repeatedly, as the flames of war that had consumed Cadia flared up anew across the other worlds of the Cadian system, as well as the Bellis Corona and Agrippina systems. Despite Chaos's significant victory and the galaxy's step closer to damnation, the Imperium and its new allies among the Eldari were prepared to continue the ceaseless struggle against the Dark Gods.